You really think you could handle being a peasant in ancient Greece? Please, you can barely survive without Wi-Fi. Imagine no bread, no breaks, and working under the blazing sun every single day. No vacations, no paycheck, and spoiler alert, life was basically work till you drop or die. So, in this video, I'm going to show you, with absolutely no sugarcoating, why you wouldn't last a single day as a humble Greek peasant. So you've just been born in ancient Greece. Congratulations, you've arrived in one of history's most celebrated civilizations. Spoiler, this is not the Athens of philosophers and democracy you're thinking of. No, you're a peasant baby in rural Greece around 500 BCE. Your first achievement? Not dying immediately. Infant mortality rates hovered around 30%. So technically, a third of you is already dead. Your parents aren't celebrating yet because they're practical people. They'll wait to see if you survive the first week before getting too attached. If you're a girl, that celebration might be more of a resigned sigh, since you're primarily viewed as a future dowry expense rather than a farmhand. Just imagine the cozy birthing experience you've had. No sterile hospital, no pain medication, just your mom screaming in a dark corner of your one-room hut while a local midwife with questionable hygiene practices yanks you into existence. The cutting-edge medical technology involved? A rusty knife to cut the umbilical cord, followed by olive oil and wine to disinfect the wound. Fancy. Now you're wrapped in swaddling clothes, so tight you can barely move, which Greeks believe would ensure your limbs grew straight. This will be your fashion statement for the next several months. You'll be bound like a little mummy, unable to move, developing fantastic pressure sores while marinating in your own bodily fluids. Fashion was clearly not a priority in ancient Greece. Now comes your first major life event, determining whether you're worth keeping. If you're visibly deformed or sickly, or if you're an unwanted female in a family with too many mouths to feed, you might experience the ancient Greek version of family planning: exposure. This delightful tradition involves placing unwanted babies in clay pots and leaving them at crossroads or garbage dumps. Best case scenario, someone picks you up as a free slave. Worst case, you become a snack for wild dogs. If you think this is bad, just wait until the naming ceremony. You won't even get a name until you're between 7 to 10 days old, during a ritual called the amphidromia, where your father carries you around the hearth to introduce you to the household gods. Until then, you're essentially baby TBD, because why waste a perfectly good name on something that might not make it to next week? Assuming you've made the cut and haven't been left on a hillside, your childhood nutrition plan begins. Hope you like goat's milk and honey, because that's what you'll be slurping down if your mother can't breastfeed. No fancy formula here, just whatever animal milk is available, sometimes delivered through primitive feeding devices made from cow horns or pottery. These unsanitary devices were basically bacterial breeding grounds. The Greek approach to baby bottles could be summarized as, if the bad milk doesn't kill them, they'll develop immunity. Brilliant healthcare strategy. You'll be breastfed until you're around 2 or 3 years old, which sounds nice until you realize it's because there's no suitable baby food and weaning you too early would likely kill you. Your mom isn't being generous. She's just keeping you alive until you're useful. Your crib is a lovely woven basket, perhaps with a layer of straw if you're fancy. Don't roll too much though, or you might end up face down in a situation you can't escape from. SIDS was just called morning surprise back then. To keep you quiet while the adults work, you might be given a rag soaked in wine or honey to suck on. Your first introduction to either substance abuse or diabetes, depending on household preference. If you're especially fussy, there's always poppy extract, nature's baby NyQuil. Nothing like starting narcotic use early. This actually explains a lot about Greek mythology. Clearly someone was high when they came up with the idea of Zeus turning into a swan to seduce women. The exciting thing about being a baby in ancient Greece is that you're basically a plaything for the gods. Got a fever? Apollo must be angry. Rash? Displeased a nymph. Colic? Clearly possessed by minor deities. Your parents will hang amulets around your neck to ward off the evil eye, and make offerings to various gods to keep you alive. These magical preventative healthcare measures are about as effective as you'd expect. The good news is that if you're a boy, you've got a festival dedicated to you. The bad news? It involves stripping you naked and whipping you in front of an altar to Artemis to test your endurance. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, except when it kills you, which it often did. You'll spend your first few years of life strapped to a wooden board if your parents are particularly concerned about your posture. Greek pediatric orthopedics involved literally binding babies to planks to ensure straight limbs. Comfort was not a consideration. You'll probably start walking around age 1 or 2, at which point you'll graduate to wearing a simple tunic, your first and possibly only garment for the next several years. Shoes? Those are for wealthy city folk, not peasant children with calloused feet. Besides, those tender feet need to toughen up for a lifetime of agricultural labor. Congratulations, you've now reached the age where you're expected to start contributing to the household. You're barely walking, but it's time to learn how to chase chickens and carry small items. Toilet training in ancient Greece was refreshingly simple. Go wherever and whenever. Eventually, someone might show you the designated corner or pot, but expectations were low. Hygiene wasn't exactly a priority, and the concept of germs was millennia away from being discovered. Your toys will be simple: clay whistles, wooden dolls, or knuckle bones from dead animals to use as dice. If you're lucky, you might get a terracotta rattle filled with pebbles. Most likely, though, your toys will be whatever sticks and rocks you find interesting. Children were expected to entertain themselves or each other while adults worked. Think of it as a self-directed Montessori education, where the curriculum is try not to die and graduation is reaching puberty. Your childhood immunization schedule consists entirely of catch every disease and either die or become immune. Measles, smallpox, dysentery. These aren't just diseases, they're childhood rites of passage. Approximately 50% of children didn't survive to age 10, so making it this far means you're already outperforming half your peers. The ancient Greeks actually had a saying, "Don't get too attached to anything that can't yet talk," which was their way of emotionally preparing for the likelihood of child death. If you think this is bad, just wait until you see their approach to medicine. Got a fever? The prescription is either wait it out or bleed the evil humors out. A real coin flip between doing nothing and actively making things worse. Greeks believed children were essentially tiny drunk adults, irrational, emotional, and in need of rigid discipline to shape them into proper humans. Your formative years will be filled with stern instructions, occasional beatings, and constant reminders that children should be seen and not heard. Family bonding time consisted of working together in the fields, listening to epic poetry recitals, if you're lucky, or religious festivals where everyone gets drunk except you, mostly. You'll be assigned chores as soon as you can walk steadily, graduating from simple tasks like feeding chickens to helping with harvests by age 5 or 6. Your childhood labor rights amount to precisely 0, and safety regulations don't exist. Lost a finger in the grain mill? That's just character building. By age 7, your childhood is basically over. If you're a boy, you'll begin more intensive training for adult work, shadowing your father in the fields. If you're a girl, you're learning household management from your mother and preparing for marriage, which could happen as early as age 12 to 14. You've already survived disease, malnutrition, accidents, and possibly the occasional war or raid. You've made it through what will likely be the easiest part of your life as a Greek peasant. The mortality rate actually improves a bit after early childhood, so you can look forward to potentially reaching your 20s before something kills you. Welcome to the next phase of your peasant life, where things really start to get interesting. Or terrible. Mostly terrible. Congratulations, you've survived infancy and early childhood. Time for your education to begin. If you're thinking this means attending a prestigious academy with toga-clad philosophers debating ethics under olive trees, I have disappointing news. Those schools were for wealthy city boys, not grubby little peasants like yourself. Your education will be more practical and significantly less philosophical. Think of it as a specialized training program with one primary focus: how not to starve to death. The curriculum includes exciting subjects like basic farming without machinery, predicting weather without meteorology, and everyone's favorite elective, avoiding death by common infections. You'll be learning by doing, which is a fancy way of saying you'll be put to work immediately. Just imagine your classroom, the great outdoors. No desks, no scrolls, no philosophical debates about the nature of virtue. Just you, the unforgiving Greek sun, and acres of land that need tending. Your textbooks are the calluses forming on your hands, and your graduation ceremony will be the day your parents decide you can handle adult work without supervision. If you're a boy, you'll follow your father everywhere, learning how to plow fields with wooden tools, care for livestock, build and repair structures, and navigate by the stars. If you're a girl, you'll shadow your mother, mastering the arts of food preparation, textile production, childcare, and managing a household economy. The gender-segregated educational system is strict. Boys who show too much interest in women's work or girls who prefer men's tasks will be quickly corrected. Ancient Greek peasants were not exactly pioneers in gender theory. Your school hours? All day, every day, from sunrise to sunset. Weekends? Those don't exist yet. Summer vacation? That's when you work even harder because it's harvest season. The concept of childhood as a protected time of play and development is still millennia away from being invented. You're basically a miniature adult with additional vulnerability to disease and predators. Your value is measured by your utility, not your potential. The Greeks did believe in education. The word pedagogue is Greek, after all, but that education was reserved for citizens with means. For peasant children, your pedagogy consisted of watch, then do it better or go hungry. If you think this is bad, just wait until you see the disciplinary system. Corporal punishment isn't just accepted, it's encouraged as the primary teaching method. Spoiler, this won't end well for anyone with learning disabilities, physical limitations, or simply a different aptitude than what's expected. There's no IEP, individualized education plan, in ancient Greece, just a sink-or-swim approach where failure could mean literal starvation for your family. That said, peasant education had some advantages over modern schooling. The student-to-teacher ratio was excellent, typically 1-to-1. There were no standardized tests, just practical assessments like did the goat die under your care? Or did you ruin the entire season's wool with your poor spinning? Relevance wasn't an issue either. Everything you learned had immediate practical application. No peasant child ever asked, when will I ever use this in real life? Because the answer was always today, if you want to eat tonight. The memorization requirements were intense, though not of written material. You needed to internalize agricultural cycles, weather patterns, animal behaviors, plant properties, and countless unwritten recipes, remedies, and rituals. Ancient Greek peasant society was primarily oral. Most peasants couldn't read or write at all. Information was transmitted through stories, songs, proverbs, and direct instruction. You'd learn hundreds of folk sayings that contained generations of agricultural wisdom. Plant beans when the oak leaves are the size of a mouse's ear, or a red sky at night is a shepherd's delight. These weren't just cute sayings. They were vital knowledge encoded in memorable formats. Failure to remember could mean crop failure, which meant famine. Talk about high-stakes education. Modern students stress about pop quizzes, but at least a failed test doesn't lead to starvation. Your extracurricular activities included exciting options like rock collecting for clearing fields, competitive weeding, extreme weight lifting, hauling water and harvests, and endurance running, usually from wild animals or hostile neighbors. Physical education wasn't a separate subject. It was integrated into everything you did. Your physical fitness regimen consisted of daily manual labor that would make modern CrossFit enthusiasts weep. By age 10, you'd likely be able to walk miles carrying heavy loads, work from dawn to dusk in scorching heat, and perform specialized tasks requiring significant strength and dexterity. The ancient Olympic athletes had nothing on peasant children when it came to functional strength and endurance. They were just peasants who had enough free time to specialize in showing off rather than producing food. This is actually the best part of your education as a Greek peasant, the practical skills. By the time you reached adolescence, you'd possess an impressive array of abilities that would make today's survival experts look like helpless infants. You could identify dozens of plants and their uses, navigate by stars, predict weather changes, construct basic structures, preserve food, make textiles from raw materials, and handle animals. You'd know how to deliver lambs, treat common ailments with herbs, make tools from available materials, and defend yourself against threats. Modern humans with their specialized knowledge might excel in narrow domains, but few possess the comprehensive practical skill set of an ancient peasant. Of course, you'd trade all this practical knowledge in an instant for antibiotics, indoor plumbing, and not having to worry about being sacrificed to appease angry gods during droughts. Religious instruction was a critical component of your education, though not in the form of theological debates. You'd learn the proper rituals for planting and harvest, the correct offerings for household gods, and the specific prayers for everything from bread-making to childbirth. Peasant religion was practical and transactional, less concerned with cosmic meaning and more focused on ensuring divine favor for earthly success. You'd learn which deities control which aspects of life and how to stay on their good side. This wasn't abstract philosophy, it was survival strategy. When your entire year's food supply depends on a good harvest, you don't take chances with annoyed deities. You learn to perform rituals correctly, not out of deep spiritual conviction, but because your family couldn't afford another failed crop or livestock disease that might result from divine displeasure. Your language arts education consisted entirely of oral tradition, learning to speak persuasively, remember stories accurately, and perhaps sing traditional songs. Mathematics meant practical counting and basic calculation, enough to avoid being cheated at market, but not enough for theoretical geometry. No peasant child ever pondered the Pythagorean theorem while plowing a field. Science education was entirely observational, understanding that certain plants grow better in certain soils, or that specific animal behaviors predict weather changes. There was no understanding of why these patterns existed, just recognition that they did. History class was stories of ancestors and local legends, passed down through generations, blending fact and mythology into practical lessons. Geography meant knowing your immediate surroundings and perhaps major landmarks that could guide travel to nearby markets. Social education was perhaps the most rigorous aspect of your upbringing. You'd learn the strict hierarchies governing Greek society and your lowly place within them. Crucial lessons included how to show proper deference to social superiors, from wealthy landowners to government officials to religious authorities. You'd master the art of keeping your eyes down, your voice respectful, and your opinions to yourself when interacting with anyone who could make your difficult life even worse. Greeks had an entire vocabulary for different types of relationships and the specific obligations they entailed. Your survival depended on understanding these unwritten social contracts and fulfilling your end of them without complaint. Modern concepts like pursuing your passion or finding yourself would be utterly alien. Your identity was predetermined by your birth, gender, and family occupation. Assessment in peasant education was brutally efficient. You either mastered a skill or you suffered immediate consequences. There were no participation trophies, no grade inflation, no curve. The evaluation criteria were binary, success or failure, with failure often having dire implications. Learn to store grain properly? Your family eats this winter. Failed to secure the livestock pen adequately? The wolves just ate next year's breeding stock. This direct feedback loop created highly competent individuals in specific domains, even if they lacked broader knowledge. The dropout rate was essentially zero. Leaving education wasn't an option unless you planned to starve or become an outlaw. The closest thing to dropping out was death, which remained a popular alternative to agricultural life throughout antiquity. By the time you reach what we'd consider adolescence, your education is largely complete. You've mastered the basic skills needed for survival and are now refining them through practice. Any specialized knowledge like herbal medicine, midwifery, or blacksmithing will be taught only to those showing particular aptitude or need. Innovation and creativity were not educational goals. Consistency and tradition were valued above all. The system produced incredibly resilient, practical humans who could survive conditions that would kill most modern people within days. However, it also reinforced strict social hierarchies, limited social mobility, and perpetuated superstitions that sometimes led to catastrophically bad decisions. Your education has prepared you perfectly for a world that hasn't changed in centuries. Unfortunately for many Greek peasants, that world was about to be rocked by wars, conquests, and philosophical revolutions that would render much of this traditional knowledge insufficient. But hey, at least you can identify which mushrooms won't kill you instantly, a skill that's surprisingly still relevant today. So you've mastered childhood and completed your peasant education. Time to experience the daily grind of an adult Greek peasant. Your alarm clock? The rooster, assuming your family is wealthy enough to own chickens. If not, its first light filtering through the cracks in your modest dwelling's walls. Rise and shine at dawn, because every moment of daylight is precious when you have no electricity. You think morning people are annoying now? In ancient Greece, sleeping past sunrise was considered moral failure. The early bird gets the worm, and a late-rising peasant gets societal scorn and possibly starvation. Your bed, by the way, was likely a straw-filled mattress on a wooden frame if you were lucky, or simply a pile of straw on the dirt floor if you weren't. Back problems weren't a medical condition in ancient Greece. They were just called being alive. Just imagine your morning routine. No toothpaste, no shower, no coffee to jumpstart your system. Dental hygiene consisted of rubbing your teeth with a cloth, possibly with some crushed herbs if you were sophisticated. The result? By age 30, your mouth would be a painful collection of rotting, discolored teeth, assuming you had any left. Morning breath wasn't a social faux pas. It was everyone's permanent condition. Bathing was an occasional luxury, not a daily event. Water had to be hauled from wells or streams, heated over precious fire, and used sparingly. Most peasants cleaned themselves by rubbing down with olive oil, then scraping it off with a curved tool called a strigil, taking dirt and dead skin with it. Deodorant? That's just a fancy word for more olive oil, perhaps with some herbs if you were feeling particularly concerned about your bouquet of body odors. Breakfast would be simple and quick, perhaps some barley porridge, a piece of bread dipped in wine, maybe some olives or cheese if available. If you think this is bad, just wait until you see lunch and dinner, which were remarkably similar. The Mediterranean diet may be celebrated today, but ancient Greek peasant cuisine was repetitive and limited. Your daily menu consisted primarily of barley bread, often hard enough to crack teeth, olives, legumes, vegetables in season, and occasional cheese or eggs. Meat was a rare luxury, usually consumed only during religious festivals when animals were sacrificed. Your daily nutrition looked nothing like the colorful Greek salads in modern restaurants. It was monotonous, often barely adequate in calories, and frequently on the verge of running out entirely before the next harvest. Your morning commute to work involved walking from your one-room dwelling to the surrounding fields, a journey of perhaps a few hundred yards. No traffic jams, but also no podcast entertainment or air-conditioned vehicle. Just you, the morning dew, and perhaps a donkey if your family was prosperous. The average Greek peasant farm was small, typically 4 to 6 acres, enough to sustain a family if the weather cooperated, the soil remained fertile, and no disaster struck. Spoiler, disaster struck constantly. Your workday would begin immediately, with tasks varying seasonally. Spring meant plowing and planting. Summer meant weeding and irrigation. Autumn meant harvesting and storing. Winter meant repairing tools and structures. Each season brought its own form of back-breaking labor, performed with wooden or simple iron tools that modern farmers would consider museum pieces rather than practical implements. The soundtrack to your day wouldn't be carefully curated playlists, but rather the rhythmic sounds of your own labor. The scrape of a hoe against soil, the rustling of grain, the bleating of goats or sheep if you own livestock. Perhaps you'd sing work songs to maintain rhythm during repetitive tasks, or tell stories to pass the time during less demanding work. Ancient Greek peasants weren't illiterate by choice. scrolls were expensive, education was for the wealthy. And frankly, when would you have time to read? Your entertainment consisted of oral traditions, music played on simple instruments, and the occasional religious festival that broke up the monotony of agricultural life. These festivals were the closest thing to a vacation you'd experience, combining religious observance with much-needed opportunities for socialization, potential matchmaking, and consumption of slightly more interesting food than usual. Water management dominated much of your daily thinking. Greece's Mediterranean climate meant seasonal rainfall, with dry summers requiring careful irrigation planning. You develop an intimate knowledge of local water sources, creating ingenious systems to direct water to crops using gravity-fed channels. Every drop was precious, especially during the scorching summer months when temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit 38 degrees Celsius. Carrying water for household use was a daily chore, usually assigned to women and children, involving heavy clay vessels and multiple trips to the nearest source. This is actually the best part of being a Greek peasant, developing calf muscles that would make modern bodybuilders weep with envy from hauling water uphill both ways. The average Greek peasant woman carried over 40 pounds of water daily, often walking several miles in the process. Modern gym memberships seem rather unnecessary by comparison. Your home would make modern tiny houses look palatial. The typical peasant dwelling was a single-room structure with walls of mud, brick, or stone, a packed earth floor, and a thatched or tiled roof. Windows were small or non-existent to maintain structural integrity and minimize heat loss in winter. Your furniture consisted of perhaps a table, a few stools, storage containers, and sleeping pallets. Decoration was minimal, a household shrine to honor ancestors and gods, perhaps some simple pottery. The central feature was the hearth, used for cooking, heating, and light. This single fire source had to be maintained carefully. Letting it go out meant the inconvenience of rekindling using friction methods or borrowing embers from neighbors. Smoke ventilation was rudimentary at best, meaning your home was perpetually smoky, your lungs constantly irritated, and your life expectancy accordingly reduced. The modern clean air movement would have a field day with ancient Greek indoor air quality standards. Privacy was a concept that existed only for the wealthy. Your entire family, parents, children, perhaps grandparents, or unmarried siblings, all shared the single room. Nighttime activities of all kinds occurred within earshot of everyone else, with perhaps only a curtain for visual separation. Bathroom facilities consisted of a chamber pot inside or a designated area outside. Toilet paper hadn't been invented. You'd use stones, leaves, or a sponge on a stick kept in a bucket of vinegar or salt water. If you lived in a village, there might be a public latrine, essentially a ditch or series of holes where everyone handled their business communally. Nothing builds neighborhood bonds quite like shared defecation space. Waste disposal was haphazard at best, contributing to the general aroma of settlements and the frequent spread of disease. The concept of germs was millennia away from discovery, so the connection between waste management and illness remained mysterious. Your clothing would consist of simple tunics made from wool or linen, depending on your region and resources. These garments were worn until they literally fell apart, then patched and worn some more. Laundering involved beating clothing with sticks at a stream or washing area, using lye soap if available or simply water if not. Most peasants owned perhaps 2 sets of clothing, one for daily wear and one slightly better version for festivals or special occasions. Shoes, if worn at all, were simple leather sandals. Many peasants worked barefoot, developing calluses thick enough to withstand rocky terrain and temperature extremes. Fashion trends didn't trickle down to peasant level. Your great-grandparents likely wore virtually identical clothing to what you wore. The clothing industry moved at a glacial pace when your fashion choices consisted entirely of tunic or slightly different colored tunic. Your daily schedule was dictated entirely by sunlight, with no artificial lighting beyond smoky oil lamps or tallow candles. Both expensive luxuries used sparingly. Your productive hours were limited to daylight. In summer, this meant extremely long work days. in winter, much shorter ones. The concept of overtime pay wouldn't be invented for another 2,500 years. During growing seasons, workdays could easily extend to 12 to 14 hours of physical labor. Agricultural urgency waited for no one. When crops needed harvesting, you worked until they were secured, regardless of exhaustion. Weather determined your activities more than any human schedule. Rain might mean a rare day of indoor work. Drought might mean desperate additional hours spent on irrigation. You planned around seasons and lunar cycles, not weekends and holidays. The phrase working for the weekend would have been meaningless. Your only breaks came with religious observances, and even those often incorporated agricultural rituals. Leisure time, when it existed at all, was simple by necessity. Men might gather to discuss local affairs, share agricultural information, or engage in competitions of strength or skill. Women socialized while performing communal tasks like wool processing or food preparation. Children played with simple toys made from natural materials or learned adult skills through imitation games. Board games using pebbles, knuckle bones, literally animal ankle bones used as dice, and simple wooden game boards provided entertainment during winter evenings or rare periods of rest. Athletic competitions occurred during festivals, combining religious observance with entertainment and community bonding. Music was created with simple instruments, pipes, lyres, drums, usually homemade and played by amateurs rather than professionals. The concept of binge watching would have been replaced by binge listening to the same old stories you'd heard 100 times before, but still enjoyed because, well, what else were you going to do? Your relationship with time differed fundamentally from modern concepts. You tracked time by the sun's position, the seasons, and agricultural necessities rather than hours and minutes. The year was marked by religious festivals and farming milestones rather than arbitrary calendar dates. Long-term planning meant preparing for next season or next year, not retirement or career advancement. Life expectancy for peasants rarely exceeded 40 years, assuming you survived childhood diseases, accidents, warfare, and periodic famines. You didn't worry about retirement plans because working until death was the universal expectation. Social security consisted entirely of having enough children who survived to adulthood and were willing to care for you when you became too infirm to work. Your concept of the future extended primarily to the next harvest, with anything beyond that considered in the realm of the gods rather than human planning. The present moment wasn't something to mindfully appreciate. It was something to endure while preparing for the next season of scarcity or abundance. Your career options as a Greek peasant were limited, to put it mildly. There was no guidance counselor suggesting you might be well suited for marketing or engineering. Your primary occupation was subsistence agriculture, with a side hustle of staying alive long enough to reproduce. The family farm wasn't some idyllic hobby with a farmer's market booth on weekends. It was the razor-thin margin between survival and starvation. Your operation likely included grain cultivation, primarily barley and wheat, olive trees if your climate permitted, perhaps grapevines, vegetables, and fruit trees. If you're picturing orderly rows and efficient modern methods, adjust your imagination accordingly. Ancient Greek farming techniques were primitive by today's standards, with wooden plows often pulled by family members rather than draft animals, which were expensive luxuries many couldn't afford. If you think this is bad, just wait until you see the irrigation systems, or lack thereof. The growing season in Greece was challenging, with hot, dry summers requiring careful water management. Your survival depended on intimate knowledge of local conditions, which slopes retained moisture, which soil types suited particular crops, which areas were prone to erosion. This knowledge wasn't written in farming manuals. It was passed down orally through generations, each adding observations from their own successes and failures. The Mediterranean climate meant winter rains and summer drought, requiring storage strategies for both water and crops. You likely practiced polyculture rather than monoculture, growing multiple crops in the same fields to hedge against disease or weather that might destroy a single crop type. This wasn't sustainable farming as a philosophical choice. It was risk management when your family's survival hung in the balance. Modern farm-to-table enthusiasts might romanticize your connection to the land, conveniently ignoring that this connection frequently included watching helplessly as everything you planted withered during drought years. Livestock management formed another crucial aspect of your agricultural portfolio. Goats and sheep were particularly valuable, providing milk, cheese, wool, meat, rarely, usually for festivals and sacrificial offerings. These hardy animals could survive on marginal land unsuitable for crops, converting inedible to humans' scrub vegetation into valuable protein and materials. Pigs might be kept if local conditions allowed, though they required more resources than goats or sheep. Chickens provided eggs daily and occasional meat. Draft animals like oxen or donkeys were major investments, often shared between multiple families or owned collectively by villages. Your relationship with these animals wasn't sentimental. They were living tools and walking food storage, not pets with Instagram accounts. That said, losing an animal to disease or predators represented a significant economic blow that could threaten your family's survival. So you develop intimate knowledge of animal health and behavior out of necessity rather than affection. The technology supporting your agricultural endeavors would make modern farmers burst into hysterical laughter. Your toolkit consisted primarily of wooden implements with perhaps some iron components if you were prosperous or had access to metalworking. The wooden plow, later tipped with iron in some regions, was the centerpiece of field preparation, often requiring multiple people to operate effectively. Hand tools included hoes, sickles, pruning knives, and flails for threshing grain. Seed was broadcast by hand, with predictably uneven results compared to modern precision planting. Irrigation, when possible, utilized gravity-fed channels laboriously dug and maintained. Crop processing was entirely manual, threshing grain by walking animals over it or beating it with flails, winnowing by tossing it into the air to let wind separate chaff from grain, grinding between stones to produce flour. Each step required significant physical exertion and time, with minimal mechanical advantage. The phrase, work smarter, not harder, wasn't applicable when all options were variations of work harder. Risk management dominated your agricultural strategy. Unlike modern farmers with crop insurance, weather forecasts, and scientific soil testing, you operated on educated guesswork reinforced by generations of observation. Crop failure meant potential starvation, so you developed multiple contingency plans. You'd plant different crops in different locations, hoping at least some would succeed regardless of weather conditions. You'd maintain seed reserves even in hungry times, ensuring next year's planting remained possible. Food preservation consumed significant effort. Drying, salting, fermenting, and storing in cool locations extended your harvest usefulness. Storage containers were primarily large ceramic pit hoy jars, buried partially in the ground to maintain cooler temperatures. These vessels represented significant investments, often passed down through generations. Pest management relied on timing, companion planting, and various concoctions believed to repel insects or animals. Some worked based on principles not understood until modern times. Others were purely superstitious but maintained because no one dared experiment when failure meant hunger. Your agricultural calendar structured the entire year, with different seasons demanding different intensive labor. Spring plowing and planting required maximum effort after winter's relative quiet. Summer brought constant irrigation concerns and weed management. Harvest periods, multiple throughout the year for different crops, required all-hands mobilization, often working from dawn until after dark to secure crops before weather changes threatened them. Even winter, the closest thing to an off-season, involved equipment repair, land clearing, and preparation for spring. This is actually the best part of being a Greek peasant farmer. The variety. Just when you got thoroughly sick of one type of backbreaking labor, the season changed and presented an entirely different type of backbreaking labor. The modern weekend was non-existent. Beyond your own family's needs, your agricultural production had broader economic implications. Ancient Greek society operated on a complex system of taxation, tribute, and obligatory contributions to various authorities. Depending on your region and historical period, you might owe portions of your harvest to local landowners, city-states, religious institutions, or occupying powers. These obligations weren't optional suggestions. Failure to meet them could result in punishment, land confiscation, or worse. The percentage demanded could range from manageable to crippling, particularly during wartime or periods of political instability. You had virtually no say in these arrangements. Peasants were subjects, not citizens with political voices. Even in democratic Athens, citizenship excluded farmers outside the city. The modern concept of taxation without representation would have seemed like a luxurious complaint compared to your reality of taxation with active oppression. If agriculture was your primary occupation, trading represented an important secondary activity. Few peasant families were completely self-sufficient. Most needed to exchange surplus from their particular specialties for necessities they couldn't produce. Local markets provided these opportunities, though transportation limitations meant these were primarily community affairs rather than regional exchanges. You might walk hours carrying heavy loads to reach trading opportunities, negotiating without the benefit of standardized currency in many periods. Barter and commodity exchange dominated rural transactions. Your bargaining position was weakest immediately after harvest, when supply was highest. Yet this was precisely when you needed to trade to secure items for the coming year. Wealthy merchants or landowners exploited this vulnerability, setting unfavorable exchange rates, knowing your limited storage capabilities and immediate needs left little room for negotiation. You developed careful relationships with trading partners over years, creating networks of mutual obligation and trust in the absence of formal contracts or enforcement mechanisms. Craft production supplemented agricultural activities, particularly during agricultural off-seasons or as specialized family traditions. Women typically produced textiles, spinning wool or flax in a thread, weaving fabric, and creating garments. This wasn't a hobby with a cute Etsy shop. It was essential production of items too expensive to purchase. A single wool tunic might represent hundreds of hours of processing, spinning, weaving, and sewing. Men typically handled woodworking, basic metalwork, if materials were available, leather processing, and building construction or repair. Pottery production, crucial for storage and cooking, required specialized knowledge of clay sources, firing techniques, and forming methods. Most households produced utilitarian wares for their own use, leaving fine pottery to specialized urban workshops. These crafts weren't expressions of personal creativity. They were functional necessities produced according to traditional methods with minimal variation. The pressure to innovate was non-existent when traditional methods had proven adequate for generations and experimentation risked wasting precious materials. The division of labor within peasant households followed strict gender and age categories. Men typically handled field preparation, construction, heavy transport, and interactions with authorities or markets. Women managed food processing, textile production, water collection, childcare, and smaller livestock. Children were assigned age-appropriate tasks from early ages, gradually taking on more responsibility as they demonstrated capability. This wasn't about gender equality or personal fulfillment. It was efficient allocation of human resources for survival. The modern concept of career satisfaction would have seemed absurdly indulgent. Your job satisfaction came exclusively from not starving to death that year, a performance metric with remarkably clarifying properties. Occupational hazards were numerous and unregulated. Back injuries from heavy lifting, cuts and infections from tools, respiratory issues from grain dust and smoke, skin damage from sun exposure, and countless repetitive stress injuries. OSHA would have had an absolute field day with ancient Greek agricultural practices. Your productivity was measured not in quarterly reports or performance reviews, but in the simple metric of survival. A successful year meant producing enough to feed your family, meet external obligations, set aside seed for next season, and perhaps have a small surplus for emergencies or special occasions. An unsuccessful year meant hunger, debt, selling critical assets, or in extreme cases, watching family members starve. The psychological burden of this razor-thin margin between adequacy and disaster created a deeply conservative approach to agricultural practices. Innovation was risky when failure had such immediate consequences. You'd follow methods proven by generations before you, making only the smallest incremental changes based on careful observation. The modern innovation mantra of move fast and break things would have been recognized as the suicidal strategy it would have been in your context. Nothing could be allowed to break because everything was essential and irreplaceable. Employment benefits? There were none beyond the fundamental arrangement of work or starve. No health insurance beyond folk remedies and religious appeals. No retirement plan beyond having children who might support you if you lived long enough to become infirm. No disability accommodation. Injury often meant reduced productivity, leading to increased vulnerability to hunger or displacement. Job security existed only as long as you could physically perform required tasks and meet obligations to those above you in the social hierarchy. Labor disputes were non-existent as a formal concept. Your options for addressing unfair treatment were limited to personal appeals, seeking community intervention, or in extreme cases, relocating entirely, assuming you could find somewhere to go. Workplace advancement meant perhaps acquiring slightly more land or livestock over decades of careful management, not promotions or raises. Your career trajectory was essentially flat, with success measured by maintaining stability rather than achieving growth or advancement. The concept of following your passion would have been met with blank incomprehension. Passion was an irrelevant luxury when survival required all available energy and resources. Your work identity was inseparable from your personal identity. You weren't someone who farmed. You were a farmer defined entirely by your productive role. Social standing, marriage prospects, community respect, all flowed from your capability as a producer and provider. This wasn't a job you could leave at the office. It was your entire existence, from dawn until dusk, from birth until death. The modern separation between professional and personal life would have been incomprehensible. Your work ethic wasn't driven by ambition or self-actualization, but by the fundamental imperative of survival and the deeply ingrained cultural values surrounding contribution to family and community. The Protestant work ethic that would emerge millennia later had its roots in these ancient agricultural societies where productivity was literally a matter of life and death. Your purpose wasn't something you discovered through introspection and exploration. It was assigned at birth based on your gender, family circumstances, and community needs. And despite the relentless labor, precarious existence, and limited horizons, the most remarkable aspect of peasant life was perhaps its continuation, generation after generation adapting to changing political systems, climate variations, and technological developments while maintaining the fundamental patterns of agricultural existence that would remain recognizable across centuries. So you've mastered the backbreaking labor of Greek peasant agriculture. Now, let's explore your thriving social life. Except, thriving isn't quite the word. Your social circle is essentially limited to your immediate family, extended relatives, and the handful of other farming families within walking distance. Hope you like these people, because they're the only humans you'll interact with regularly for your entire life. The modern concept of choosing your friends based on shared interests or compatible personalities would seem like bizarre luxury. Your relationships were determined almost entirely by proximity and necessity. The people who helped you harvest your crops weren't your squad. They were the neighbors you were bound to through mutual survival pacts that had existed for generations. If you think this is bad, just wait until you see the dating scene. The family unit was the fundamental building block of peasant society, but forget any notions of nuclear families with 2.5 children. Your household likely included multiple generations, grandparents, parents, children, possibly unmarried aunts or uncles, all crammed into that single-room dwelling we discussed earlier. Privacy wasn't just limited, it was virtually non-existent. Family dynamics weren't governed by pop psychology or communication strategies, but by strict hierarchies based on age and gender. The oldest male was typically the unquestioned authority on all matters. Women held significant power within domestic spheres, but little formal authority in public life. Children were expected to be obedient and productive from early ages, with modern concepts of childhood development entirely absent. Your family wasn't just your emotional support system. It was your economic unit, labor force, healthcare provider, educational institution, and retirement plan all rolled into one. Family loyalty wasn't about emotional attachment, though that might exist. It was about survival interdependence. Marriage in peasant society bore little resemblance to modern romantic partnerships. Matches were arranged with primary consideration given to economic factors, land consolidation, and labor capabilities. The modern question, are they compatible, would have been replaced with, do they have access to that water source we need? Or will their family's olive grove complement our grain fields? For women, marriage meant transferring from your father's authority to your husband's, typically at a young age, 14 to 16. For men, marriage often waited until you had established some economic foundation, usually in your 20s. The dowry system placed enormous pressure on families with daughters, requiring years of saving to assemble the required goods, animals, or land that would accompany a bride to her new household. This is actually the best part of ancient Greek marriage. The practical approach eliminated the need for awkward dating rituals, expensive engagement rings, or agonizing over whether someone was the one. Your spouse was whoever made economic sense for your family, and romantic compatibility was considered an occasional lucky bonus rather than a requirement. The parent-child relationship was shaped by harsh realities. High child mortality rates meant emotional attachment was often tempered by the practical expectation of loss. Children were valued primarily for their eventual economic contribution and continuation of the family line. The notion of raising children to pursue their own happiness or self-fulfillment would have seemed not just indulgent, but actively harmful to their survival chances. Discipline was strict and often physical, with obedience valued above curiosity or independence. Yet within these seemingly harsh parameters, genuine affection certainly existed. Parents protected and nurtured children as best they could within extremely limited resources. Children typically remained geographically close to parents throughout life, with multiple generations working the same land and supporting each other across the life cycle. The modern phenomenon of adult children moving far away for career opportunities would have been both practically impossible and culturally unthinkable. Gender roles in peasant society were rigid and comprehensive. From birth, your gender determined virtually every aspect of your life. What skills you learned, what spaces you occupied, what authority you held, what future awaited you. Men's domain was public-facing, fields, markets, civic spaces. Women's domain was domestic, the household, food processing, textile production, childcare. These weren't just social conventions, but economic necessities in a world of intensive manual labor where physical strength differences had significant practical implications. Women weren't excluded from agricultural work by any means. They participated intensively during crucial periods like harvest, but their primary productive contributions typically centered around processing rather than production. The goddess Hestia, keeper of the hearth, was worshipped primarily by women, while Demeter, goddess of the harvest, received devotion from both genders, reflecting this division of labor. Female-only spaces and male-only spaces created separate social worlds that occasionally intersected but maintained distinct cultures, concerns, and communication patterns. Your community relationships extended beyond family, but remained fundamentally local. The concept of being a citizen of the world would have been meaningless. Your identity was inextricably tied to your specific locality. Neighboring farms formed tight networks of mutual aid, sharing tools, assisting with labor-intensive tasks like barn raising or harvesting, providing support during crises. These weren't charitable arrangements, but reciprocal obligations. The Greek concept of xenia, guest friendship, created formalized relationships of hospitality and exchange that could span generations. When you hosted a traveler, you weren't just being nice. You were participating in a sacred obligation believed to be overseen by Zeus himself. In a world without insurance or social safety nets, these community bonds provided the only security against disaster. However, these tight-knit communities also featured intense social surveillance. Everyone knew everyone's business. Gossip spread instantly, and deviation from accepted norms could result in devastating ostracism. The phrase, "it takes a village," wasn't about enriching childhood. It was about ensuring conformity. Social hierarchy in Greek peasant society was rigid and multi-layered. At the broadest level, free citizens, predominantly male, stood above slaves who had no legal rights, though the line between poor peasants and slaves could be surprisingly thin in economic reality. Within free society, wealth and land ownership created further stratification. As a peasant, you occupied a middle position at best, above slaves, but well below landed aristocracy or urban merchants. Local big shots might own the land you farmed, requiring share payments or labor obligations. Religious authorities held significant social power, as did individuals with specialized knowledge or skills like blacksmiths or healers. Age granted automatic status, with elders commanding respect regardless of other factors. This hierarchical system wasn't just about who got the best seat at festivals. It determined who spoke first in community decisions, who received priority during resource distribution, who could marry whom, and whose interests prevailed during disputes. Social mobility existed, but was extremely limited. A particularly prosperous peasant might acquire more land over decades of careful management, but transformative class jumping was rare. Conflict resolution in small communities couldn't rely on formal legal systems, which were distant or non-existent for most peasants. Instead, disputes were handled through community mediation, typically led by respected elders or religious figures. The goal wasn't abstract justice, but practical restoration of community function. When everyone depends on everyone else for survival, prolonged conflicts are unaffordable luxuries. Serious infractions might be referred to authorities in larger settlements, but most issues were handled locally through systems of restitution, public shaming, or in extreme cases, ostracism. The threat of being excluded from community support networks was often sufficient to ensure compliance with norms. Blood feuds could develop between families, sometimes lasting generations, but even these operated within understood parameters that prevented them from completely disrupting agricultural cooperation. Your reputation was your most valuable social possession, built carefully over years through reliability, reciprocity, and adherence to community standards. Damaging it through dishonesty or norm violation could have consequences far beyond any immediate gain. Communication networks operated through entirely different channels than today's social media. News traveled by word of mouth, with regular markets serving as information exchanges as much as economic ones. Travelers, merchants, soldiers, religious pilgrims brought news from distant regions, often distorted through multiple retellings. Literacy was extremely rare among peasants, making written communication irrelevant to daily life. Important information was transmitted through oral traditions, often incorporated into stories, songs, or sayings to aid memory. Public announcements in villages might be made by designated criers or during religious gatherings. The information ecosystem was local, slow, and often unreliable, yet surprisingly effective for transmitting practically relevant knowledge. Agricultural innovations, for instance, spread gradually through demonstration and observation rather than written instruction. Your understanding of the world beyond your immediate surroundings would be vague at best, composed of second-hand accounts, travelers' tales, and religious teachings rather than direct knowledge. Entertainment and social bonding occurred primarily through communal activities rather than passive consumption. Religious festivals provided the major opportunities for celebration, featuring feasting, including rare meat consumption, music, dance, athletic competitions, and dramatic performances. These weren't just entertainment, but religious obligations and community-building exercises. Weddings, funerals, and other life transitions were marked by ritual gatherings that reinforced social bonds. Daily entertainment was integrated with productive work. Singing during repetitive tasks, storytelling during evening meal preparation, simple games played with natural materials. Alcohol, primarily wine diluted with water, facilitated social interaction during festivals and gatherings, though public drunkenness was generally frowned upon as wasteful and potentially dangerous in a subsistence context. These social occasions weren't just fun diversions. They were crucial psychological safety valves in lives dominated by physical labor and constant precarity. They also served practical functions. Festivals often coincided with agricultural transitions. Marriages created economic alliances, and funerals redistributed the deceased's possessions within community networks. Life transitions were marked by communal rituals rather than individual milestones. Birth, coming of age, marriage, elderhood, and death were celebrated or mourned through established ceremonial practices that emphasized the individual's place within community and cosmic order rather than personal achievement or uniqueness. These transitions weren't just symbolic, but practical. They marked changes in social status, work responsibilities, and authority. For women, menarche, first menstruation, marked eligibility for marriage. For men, military service or demonstrated productive capability might mark the transition to full adult status. Elderhood brought increased social authority, but decreased physical productivity, requiring community accommodation. Death rituals ensured proper transition to the afterlife, while redistributing the deceased's resources among the living. These community-centered life transitions stand in stark contrast to modern individualistic celebrations of personal milestones. Your life story wasn't yours to write. It followed a predetermined script with limited variation, embedded within collective narratives that had sustained your community for generations. The psychological landscape of peasant social life differed fundamentally from modern expectations. The concept of privacy as a right or expectation simply didn't exist. Your thoughts, behaviors, and choices were community property, subject to scrutiny and judgment. Individual self-fulfillment took distant backseat to collective survival and tradition maintenance. Yet within these constraints, human connection flourished in ways modern people might envy. Deep intergenerational bonds, lifelong friendships forged through shared labor, community support during crises, and a profound sense of belonging and place. The modern epidemic of loneliness would have been incomprehensible in a world where solitude was rare and social connections were constant, if not always chosen. Your social identity was never in question. It was assigned at birth, reinforced through daily interaction, and maintained until death. The existential questions that plague modern individuals, who am I? What is my purpose? Where do I belong? Were answered automatically by your position within family, community, and tradition. This certainty came at the enormous cost of personal freedom, but provided psychological stability that many modern people struggle to achieve through individual effort. Your relationships weren't just connections you formed. They were the fundamental structure of your existence, determining everything from daily activities to life chances to spiritual standing. The religious life of a Greek peasant was nothing like the clean, philosophical Olympian religion you might imagine from reading about Socrates or viewing marble statues in museums. While the 12 major gods certainly existed in your cosmology, your daily spiritual practice had more to do with local deities, household spirits, agricultural rituals, and a complex web of superstitions than with lofty theological debates. Religion wasn't a separate domain of life you visited on special occasions. It permeated every aspect of existence, from planting seeds to building structures to treating illnesses. There is no distinction between religious and secular activities. Everything had spiritual dimensions and implications. If you think this is bad, just wait until you see the amount of your precious resources that went toward appeasing invisible forces you couldn't control. Your religious calendar structured the entire year, with festivals marking seasonal transitions crucial to agricultural success. Major celebrations included the Thesmophoria, honoring Demeter to ensure fertility, the anthesteria, opening new wine and honoring the dead, and the thargelia, purification before harvest. These weren't optional cultural events, but community obligations believed to directly impact agricultural outcomes. Participation wasn't about personal spiritual fulfillment, but collective insurance against divine displeasure. The modern concept of individual religious choice would have seemed not just strange, but actively dangerous to community welfare. These festivals combined religious observance with practical knowledge transmission. The timing of planting, harvesting, and other agricultural activities was encoded in religious calendars, ensuring crucial information passed between generations. Your religious observance wasn't separate from your agricultural practice. It was an integral component of your survival strategy. The household formed your primary religious unit, centered around the hearth, representing the goddess Hestia and family ancestors. Daily rituals included pouring libations, small offerings of wine, oil, or water, maintaining the hearth fire, and acknowledging household deities before meals. These weren't performative gestures, but practical relationships with forces believed to directly impact family welfare. Household gods needed regular acknowledgement and offerings. Neglecting them invited misfortune. Family ancestors required proper burial and continuing offerings to prevent their restless spirits from causing problems for the living. This is actually the best part of ancient Greek religious practice, the practical approach to spiritual beings. Gods and spirits weren't abstract concepts, but transaction partners in ongoing exchanges, offerings and proper behavior in return for protection and favor. This transactional approach made perfect sense in a precarious agricultural context where inexplicable events, storms, disease, crop failure, could devastate survival chances. Better to maintain good relationships with all potentially influential entities than risk supernatural retaliation. Agricultural rituals punctuated the farming cycle, with specific observances for plowing, planting, and harvesting. Before breaking ground with the plow, libations would be poured to earth deities. The first and last sheaves of grain received special treatment, often dedicated to particular gods or used in protective magic for the next season's crops. These weren't superstitious additions to real agricultural work. They were considered essential components of successful farming, as important as seed quality or soil preparation. The Greek agricultural pantheon was extensive. Demeter governed grain, Dionysus oversaw vines, Athena claimed olives, while countless minor deities and nature spirits influenced everything from beehives to weather patterns. Modern agricultural science separates effective techniques from symbolic ones, but this distinction would have been meaningless to you. When your entire year's food supply depended on factors beyond your control, every possible influence, practical, spiritual, magical, was worth addressing. Birth, marriage, and death, the major transitions of human life, were thoroughly embedded in religious frameworks. Childbirth occurred under the watchful eyes of Aletheia and Artemis, with specific rituals to protect both mother and infant during this dangerous passage. Marriage ceremonies included sacrifices to Hera and other deities governing household formation, while specific rituals around the hearth and threshold marked the bride's transition into a new household's religious community. Death required elaborate purification and proper burial practices, not just to honor the deceased, but to protect the living from pollution and ghostly retribution. These weren't just symbolic ceremonies, but practical interventions in a world where spiritual forces directly influenced human welfare. Improper handling of these transitions risked not just social disapproval, but divine punishment affecting the entire community. Religious officiants, primarily priestesses for female-centered rituals and priests for male-centered ones, held significant social authority based on their crucial role in maintaining proper relationships between human and divine realms. Divination, attempting to discern divine will or future outcomes, formed a crucial component of decision-making. Before significant undertakings like planting, building, marriage, or travel, various forms of divination might be employed. These range from sophisticated methods requiring specialist interpretation, examining sacrificial animal entrails, to everyday practices accessible to anyone, observing bird flight patterns or interpreting dreams. These weren't superstitious add-ons, but integral parts of the decision-making process, providing guidance in a world of limited information and high consequence for errors. The modern separation between rational planning and irrational divination would have been incomprehensible. When you have no meteorological forecasting, no soil testing, no medical diagnostics, divination provides a structured method for making decisions under uncertainty. The psychological benefits were significant. Having performed the proper divination, you could proceed with confidence rather than paralyzing anxiety about unknown outcomes. Of course, confirmation bias ensured that successful outcomes reinforced belief in the divination method, while failures could be attributed to improper procedure or competing divine influences rather than the fundamental validity of the approach. Magic and medicine overlapped extensively in peasant practice, with little distinction between natural and supernatural healing. Illness might be attributed to divine displeasure, miasma, pollution, humor imbalance, or spirit possession, with treatments addressing both physical symptoms and presumed spiritual causes simultaneously. Healing involved herbal remedies, many of which contained genuinely effective pharmacological compounds. Physical interventions like massage or bleeding, dietary adjustments, and religious/magical elements like prayers, amulets, or incantations. Different healing traditions coexisted. Some practitioners emphasized empirical approaches based on observation, while others focused on supernatural causation and intervention. From your perspective as a patient, this distinction was irrelevant. You'd use whatever combination seemed most likely to work. Some treatments were surprisingly effective based on medicinal properties not understood until modern times. Others were neutral but psychologically comforting. Still others were actively harmful but maintained through tradition and confirmation bias. Without controlled studies or germ theory, separating effective from ineffective treatments was virtually impossible, leading to medical traditions that combined genuine pharmaceutical knowledge with completely unfounded practices. Your relationship with the major Olympian gods existed primarily through community-level worship rather than personal devotion. Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, and the other major deities received formal worship at temples, typically located in larger settlements rather than rural areas. As a peasant, your interaction with this official religion occurred primarily during major festivals rather than daily practice. The elaborate mythological stories associated with these gods were known to you through oral tradition, providing important cultural context, but your daily religious practice focused more on immediate forces affecting agriculture and household. This wasn't a matter of belief versus unbelief. The major gods were accepted as real and powerful, but of practical prioritization. Your limited resources for offerings and religious observance were directed toward entities with the most direct impact on your daily welfare. The grand temples and elaborate ceremonies of urban centers were impressive but peripheral to your religious experience, which centered around local sacred sites, household shrines, and agricultural rituals. The supernatural landscape extended far beyond the familiar 12 Olympians to include a teeming population of lesser deities, nature spirits, heroes, and potentially dangerous entities. Nymphs inhabited springs, rivers, and trees, requiring acknowledgement when their domains were utilized. Heroes, deceased humans elevated to semi-divine status through exceptional deeds or divine parentage, received cult worship at tombs or designated shrines, often focused on their ability to intervene in human affairs. The dead themselves required proper treatment to prevent them from becoming restless and harmful. Various dangerous supernatural entities populated the margins. Lamia, who threatened children, Impuzi, who seduced and consumed unwary travelers, and various malevolent spirits causing disease or misfortune. Navigation of this complex spiritual ecosystem required extensive traditional knowledge about which entities required which forms of acknowledgement, appeasement, or avoidance. Modern fantasy role-playing games with their elaborate bestiary of creatures, each requiring specific approaches, actually parallel this aspect of ancient religious life surprisingly well, though with considerably lower perceived stakes. Pollution and purification concepts govern many aspects of daily life, creating an invisible moral geography of clean and unclean spaces, objects, and conditions. Childbirth, death, sexual activity, and certain diseases all generated miasma, pollution, requiring specific purification rituals. Boundaries between properties, settlements, or natural features held special significance and often hosted protective rituals or markers. Certain locations were inherently sacred or dangerous based on natural features or historical events. This wasn't just symbolic classification, but practical risk management in a world where invisible forces could cause visible harm. The modern equivalent might be radiation zones or biohazard areas, invisible dangers requiring specific protocols. Without germ theory or environmental toxicology, the pollution framework provided a functional system for avoiding genuinely dangerous situations, decomposing bodies, contaminated water, while also incorporating moral and spiritual dimensions. The system wasn't perfectly aligned with actual health risks by modern understanding, but it provided practical guidance that often improved outcomes even without accurate causal theories. The psychological landscape of ancient Greek religious belief differed fundamentally from modern frameworks. You didn't believe in gods, spirits, and supernatural forces as an intellectual proposition. You experienced them as present and active in your daily life. Unusual events, dreams, sudden emotions, unexpected successes or failures all might be interpreted as divine or spiritual intervention. This wasn't a primitive misunderstanding, but a different perceptual framework that integrated experiences modern people might categorize separately as psychological, coincidental, natural, or supernatural. The gods weren't distant abstractions, but present actors in an ongoing drama that included human and divine participants. This perspective wasn't inherently more anxiety-producing than modern materialist frameworks. In some ways, it provided greater psychological resources for managing uncertainty and tragedy. When crop failure could be attributed to divine displeasure rather than random misfortune, it provided both explanation and potential remedy through proper rituals and offerings. The system offered agency in situations where material interventions were limited or impossible. Your religious and belief systems weren't static traditions, but adaptive frameworks responding to changing conditions. While core practices remained stable across generations, specific observances evolve in response to agricultural successes and failures, political changes, exposure to new influences through trade or conquest, and community experiences. This wasn't conscious innovation. You would perceive yourself as maintaining tradition rather than creating it, but gradual adaptation that maintained functional aspects while incorporating new elements that proved useful. The resulting system combined remarkable resilience. Core agricultural rituals remained recognizable across centuries. With flexibility, new deities could be incorporated, ritual details modified, and practices abandoned when consistently ineffective. Unlike modern religious systems often defined by written texts and formal theologies, peasant religious practice emphasized correct action over correct belief, practical results over theological consistency, and community consensus over individual interpretation. The gods didn't care what you thought about them as long as you performed the proper rituals and maintained appropriate boundaries. This pragmatic approach to spiritual life ensured that religious practice remained relevant to agricultural success and community cohesion rather than becoming detached from practical concerns. So you've survived thus far as a Greek peasant. You've mastered the agricultural cycle, navigated the social hierarchy, and maintained proper relationships with gods and spirits. Impressive. Now let's discuss all the ways you'll probably die anyway. Ancient Greece wasn't exactly known for its stellar life expectancy, with the average peasant lucky to reach 35 to 40 years. This wasn't because people aged faster back then. If you somehow made it to old age, you could potentially reach your 60s or even 70s. The problem was that most people didn't make it that far, thanks to a veritable smorgasbord of everyday dangers that modern humans have largely forgotten. If you think this is bad, just wait until you hear about ancient Greek healthcare. Disease was your most persistent enemy, striking without warning and with little effective treatment available. The Mediterranean climate created perfect conditions for malaria, which was endemic throughout much of Greece. This wasn't the occasional mosquito bite of modern camping trips. This was a recurring, debilitating illness that could weaken you for life if it didn't kill you outright. Dysentery and other gastrointestinal diseases flourished due to contaminated water sources and non-existent sanitation. A simple case of diarrhea, a minor inconvenience today, could rapidly become life-threatening through dehydration. Tuberculosis spread easily in crowded winter living conditions, while pneumonia could develop from common colds with no antibiotics to halt its progress. Childhood diseases we now vaccinate against, measles, mumps, diphtheria, regularly swept through communities, killing or permanently disabling significant percentages of children. Parasitic infections were nearly universal, with intestinal worms, lice, and other unwelcome bodily residents causing chronic health issues. Your immune system wasn't just fighting occasional battles. It was engaged in constant warfare against a diverse array of pathogens with minimal reinforcements. Injuries posed threats far beyond their immediate damage. A simple cut from a farming implement could develop into a life-threatening infection within days. Broken bones might heal improperly, leading to permanent disability if they didn't kill you through infection or internal bleeding first. Burns from cooking fires or metalworking were common and serious, with no effective treatments beyond crude poultices and prayers. Chronic injuries from repetitive agricultural work, back problems, joint deterioration, hernias accumulated over time, gradually reducing your productivity and quality of life with no surgical interventions available. Even minor injuries could prove fatal through secondary infection or by reducing your work capacity during critical agricultural periods. Modern people worry about catastrophic injuries, but for you, even seemingly minor damage could begin a cascade of complications, ending in death or permanent disability. The concept of walking it off took on literal meaning. You continued working through pain and injury because the alternative was starvation for your entire family. Medical care existed in ancient Greece, but not in forms you'd recognize or particularly want to experience. Hippocrates and his followers developed surprisingly sophisticated observational medicine, but their theoretical framework of bodily humors led to treatments ranging from occasionally helpful to actively harmful. For peasants, formal medical practitioners were largely inaccessible anyway, located primarily in urban centers and serving wealthier clients. Your healthcare came primarily from local traditional healers using combinations of herbal remedies, some genuinely effective, others useless or dangerous, folk practices, and religious/magical interventions. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia beyond alcohol or opium preparations, using non-sterile instruments, and with no understanding of infection. The most common medical intervention, bloodletting, actively weakened patients already fighting disease. This is actually the best part of ancient Greek medical care, the low expectations. When effective treatments were genuinely rare, not expecting to be cured protected you from the crushing disappointment modern patients feel when medicine fails them. Your relationship with illness was fundamentally different. Disease wasn't something to be conquered, but an inevitable life component to be endured, with recovery attributed to divine favor as much as human intervention. Agricultural accidents claimed countless peasant lives and limbs. Wooden plows could strike rocks and violently jerk, causing back injuries or trampling by draft animals. Harvesting with sickles led to deep lacerations, particularly when working rapidly during critical weather windows. Grain processing using threshing sledges or flails resulted in crushed extremities and head injuries. Transport accidents were common. Carts overturning on rough terrain, loads shifting during carrying, animals bolting while hitched to equipment. Falls from trees during fruit or olive harvesting could cause paralysis or death. Grain storage created risks of suffocation in enclosed spaces or collapse of heavy storage containers. Modern workplace safety regulations and equipment design standards emerge from centuries of precisely these preventable tragedies. Your risk assessment consisted entirely of personal experience and community wisdom, with no systematic analysis of accident patterns or engineering solutions to common hazards. When accidents occurred, minimal first aid and non-existent rehabilitation services meant even survivors often faced permanent disability and reduced productive capacity. Environmental hazards represented another constant threat category. The Mediterranean climate brought seasonal challenges. Summer drought could destroy crops and leave communities starving, while winter storms caused flooding, structural damage, and hypothermia in inadequately heated dwellings. Lightning strikes posed serious risks to those caught in open fields during sudden storms. Wildfires could spread rapidly through drought-stricken landscapes, destroying crops, structures, and occasionally entire communities. Earthquakes occurred regularly in geologically active regions of Greece, collapsing structures with no warning and sometimes triggering tsunamis in coastal areas. Extreme heat posed its own dangers, with heat stroke and dehydration threatening those working in fields during summer months. Modern weather forecasting, emergency services, and building codes have dramatically reduced these risks. But for you, environmental threats arrived with minimal warning and no systematic response beyond neighbor-helping-neighbor community efforts. Food security remained precarious despite your agricultural expertise. Crop failures occurred regularly due to drought, flooding, pest infestations, or plant diseases. Storage losses from rodents, insects, mold, and spoilage could claim significant portions of harvested crops before consumption. Grain supplies typically ran lowest just before new harvests, creating annual hunger seasons when nutrition was most limited. Famine wasn't an abstract concept, but a recurring reality within generational memory of most communities. Even in good years, seasonal nutritional deficiencies caused health problems. Limited fresh produce during winter months led to vitamin deficiencies, while protein sources were chronically inadequate for many peasant diets. The modern food system, with its year-round availability, preservation technologies, and transportation networks, has eliminated the direct connection between local agricultural conditions and survival that dominated your existence. Food wasn't just sustenance, but security, with each successful harvest providing psychological relief as much as physical nourishment. Human conflicts added another deadly dimension to peasant vulnerability. Ancient Greece wasn't a unified nation, but a collection of frequently warring city-states and kingdoms. While famous battles like Marathon or Thermopylae might dominate historical accounts, the reality for peasants was more often small-scale raiding, pillaging, and destruction of agricultural resources. Armies foraged, often forcibly, from lands they passed through, potentially taking a season's food supply in days. Fields became battlegrounds. Olive groves, representing decades of investment, were deliberately destroyed to damage enemy economies, and livestock was seized as portable wealth. Even when not directly targeted, peasants suffered collateral damage from nearby conflicts. Military service requirements could remove critical labor from farms during important agricultural periods. Political instability meant taxation and tribute demands could change suddenly with new rulers or alliances. Unlike wealthy citizens who might flee to fortified cities during conflicts, peasants were tied to their land and livestock, unable to abandon their livelihood even when danger approached. The modern concept of civilian protection during warfare would have seemed like fantasy to you. Social and legal vulnerabilities compounded physical dangers. As a peasant, your political rights were limited or non-existent, depending on your specific location and historical period. Legal protections that did exist often failed to extend fully to lower social classes. Accusations of crimes or religious offenses could lead to execution or exile with minimal due process. Debt could result in enslavement or loss of land, creating a precarious balance between necessary borrowing for seed or equipment and the risk of permanent destitution. Women faced additional vulnerabilities, with limited legal standing independent from male relatives and significant risks during childbirth and reproductive years. Children had no protected status, their treatment entirely dependent on family circumstances and community norms. Elderly or disabled individuals who could no longer contribute productively might face neglect or abandonment when resources grew scarce. The modern social safety net of pensions, disability support, child protection services, and legal aid evolved specifically to address these vulnerabilities that were simply accepted facts of life in your world. Wildlife and vermin presented ongoing threats beyond their impact on crops and stored food. Venomous snakes, including vipers, inhabited agricultural areas, their bites potentially fatal with no antivenom available. Wolves remained present in many Greek regions, threatening livestock and occasionally humans, particularly children. Wild boars could inflict serious injuries when encountered during forest foraging or hunting. Insects spread disease, damaged crops, and contaminated food stores. Rodents consumed and contaminated grain supplies while spreading diseases of their own. Even domesticated animals posed serious risks. Kicks from horses or oxen, gorings from bulls or rams, and bites from territorial dogs caused significant injuries and deaths. Rabies existed with no treatment beyond palliative care for the inevitably fatal progression. Modern pest control, wildlife management, veterinary medicine, and habitat separation have dramatically reduced these once common dangers, transforming them from everyday threats to exceptional occurrences. The cumulative psychological impact of these constant dangers created a fundamentally different relationship with mortality than most modern people experience. Death wasn't a distant eventuality, but an ever-present possibility that claimed family members and neighbors regularly throughout life. This wasn't necessarily more psychologically damaging than modern death denial. In some ways, the integration of mortality into daily awareness created resilience and perspective that modern death-avoidant cultures struggle to develop. Religious frameworks provided meaningful context for suffering and death, while community support systems offered practical and emotional assistance during crises. The expectation of hardship didn't eliminate grief, but normalized it as an inevitable life component rather than an exceptional tragedy. This wasn't fatalistic resignation, but practical adaptation to unalterable circumstances. The ancient Greek philosophical traditions that emphasized accepting what cannot be changed emerged directly from this lived reality, offering psychological strategies for maintaining function and purpose despite constant vulnerability and loss. Your survival strategy against these multifaceted threats wasn't technological innovation or institutional protection, but community resilience and practical knowledge accumulated across generations. You learned which plants had medicinal properties, which weather signs predicted storms, which storage methods best preserved food, which construction techniques withstood earthquakes, and which conflict indicators suggested it was time to hide valuables. You developed sophisticated risk management approaches, diversifying crops to hedge against specific failures, maintaining seed reserves even during hunger periods, creating reciprocal support networks with neighbors, and ritualizing crucial knowledge to ensure accurate transmission across generations. These weren't conscious risk mitigation strategies, but embedded cultural practices evolved through centuries of trial and error, with successful approaches surviving because the people who practiced them survived to pass them on. Your most valuable inheritance wasn't land or tools, but this accumulated wisdom that slightly improved your odds against the innumerable threats surrounding you. If you've somehow survived all these dangers into middle age, you've beaten the statistical odds, but the hardest challenges might still await you as your body begins to fail while your society has no concept of retirement. So you've somehow survived the gauntlet of disease, injury, famine, and conflict that constituted everyday peasant life. Against all odds, you're still breathing. Now you might be wondering if there's any opportunity for advancement, achievement, or, dare we dream, glory in this relentlessly difficult existence. The short answer, not really. The slightly longer answer, occasionally, but probably not in ways you'd expect or necessarily want. While urban Greeks might achieve fame through politics, philosophy, or military leadership, the opportunities for peasant glory were significantly more constrained. If you think this is bad, just wait until you see what actually counted as moving up in the world for the average Greek farmer. The most realistic path to improved status lay in agricultural success, gradually accumulating slightly more land, livestock, or productive capacity than your neighbors. This wasn't rapid social mobility, but incremental advantage gained through decades of careful management, favorable weather, lucky timing, and avoiding catastrophe. Perhaps you successfully introduced a more productive crop variety, developed a particularly effective irrigation system, or bred livestock with superior characteristics. These achievements wouldn't make you famous beyond your immediate community, but they could translate into concrete advantages: a slightly larger house, the ability to hire occasional labor rather than doing everything yourself, better marriage prospects for your children, or greater influence in community decisions. This doesn't exactly compare to modern rags to riches stories or even medieval tales of peasants becoming knights through exceptional deeds. Your success story would sound more like started with 3 goats, ended with 12 goats, and a second olive grove. Revolutionary? No. Better than starving? Absolutely. Religious service offered another potential avenue for elevated status. Certain priesthoods remained open to peasants, particularly those serving agricultural deities or local cults. While major urban temples typically reserved positions for elite families, rural religious roles often went to individuals who demonstrated particular devotion, knowledge of tradition, or signs of divine favor. Becoming a respected ritual specialist, someone who knew the proper procedures for planting blessing, birth rituals, funeral rites, or healing ceremonies, could grant significant social standing without requiring wealth or political connections. These weren't full-time occupations, but specialized roles performed alongside continued agricultural work. This is actually the best part of ancient Greek status mobility. Religious authority was somewhat meritocratic, allowing individuals from humble backgrounds to gain influence through knowledge and perceived spiritual effectiveness rather than inherited position. Of course, this influence remained bounded within the religious sphere and rarely translated into broader political power or economic advantage. Military service presented a complex opportunity mix for peasants. During various historical periods, Greek armies transitioned from aristocratic cavalry forces to hoplite phalanxes that incorporated broader citizen populations, including prosperous peasants who could afford the required equipment. Distinguishing yourself in battle could bring recognition, spoils, and potentially citizenship benefits in some city-states. However, military glory came with enormous risks. Death, disabling injury, or extended absence from your farm during critical agricultural periods could leave your family destitute, even if you personally survived and gained honors. For poorer peasants, military participation might mean serving as lightly armed skirmishers with even higher casualty rates and fewer potential rewards than hoplite service. Unlike modern professional militaries with clear career advancement structures, ancient Greek military participation was episodic and often economically detrimental even when successful. The glory of battlefield victory might feed your pride, but it wouldn't necessarily feed your family if you returned to find crops failed in your absence. Craft specialization offered limited advancement opportunities for those with particular aptitudes. While most peasants maintained some craft production alongside agriculture, those who developed exceptional skill in pottery, metalworking, woodworking, textile production, or other specialized crafts might gradually shift their economic focus toward these activities if markets were accessible. This wasn't abandoning agriculture entirely, but rebalancing activities to emphasize higher value products over subsistence farming. Such specialization required not just skill, but favorable geographic positioning near trade routes or urban markets, making it inaccessible to isolated rural populations. Even successful craft specialists rarely achieve dramatic status elevation. They simply gain somewhat greater economic security and potentially improved living standards. The modern equivalent might be shifting from general retail work to specialized skilled labor, better compensation, but hardly a transformation of social class. Marketplace success represented another potential, if limited, advancement path. If your farm produced surplus with particular value, exceptional olive oil, distinctive wine, sought-after honey, or reliable seed stock, you might develop trading relationships extending beyond local exchanges. Success in this domain required not just quality production, but shrewd negotiation skills, reliable transportation methods, and established relationships with merchants or urban markets. The risks were substantial. Investing in expanded production could leave you vulnerable if markets shifted, transportation was disrupted, or weather affected quality. Even successful market participation rarely led to transformative wealth. It more typically provided incremental advantages that accumulated over generations rather than individual lifetimes. Your great-grandchildren might eventually become merchant class through continued expansion of trading activities begun by your initial agricultural surpluses, but you'd likely remain primarily identified as a farmer with some additional trading activities. Marriage and family alliances offered another strategy for improving position, though this operated at the family rather than individual level. Arranging advantageous marriages for children could forge connections with slightly more prosperous families, potentially leading to shared resources, inheritance possibilities, or expanded land access. Successful families might practice strategic marriage over generations, gradually improving their position through carefully considered alliances. This wasn't romantic love as a social mobility strategy, but calculated resource consolidation across family lines. For particularly successful peasant families, marriage connections might eventually reach into the lower tiers of urban citizenry or merchant classes, creating bridgeheads into different social spheres. Of course, this strategy worked in reverse as well. Families experiencing hardship might arrange marriages with more secure households to prevent complete destitution, effectively trading social standing for survival security. Community leadership roles provided status elevation without necessarily changing economic circumstances. Respected elders might be selected for positions adjudicating local disputes, representing community interests to distant authorities, or organizing collective work projects. These roles conferred significant social standing and influence, but typically little direct material benefit. They were based on demonstrated wisdom, fairness, and adherence to community standards rather than wealth or formal education. Such positions weren't campaigns won through popularity, but gradually accumulated respect, manifested in increased community reliance on your judgment. This form of success might seem limited by modern standards focused on individual advancement, but in a world where community opinion directly impacted your survival chances, being a respected voice carried significant practical value beyond mere status considerations. Epic failures proved considerably easier to achieve than epic successes in the peasant context, with potentially multi-generational consequences. Mismanaging resources during crisis periods, losing critical assets through poor decisions, or falling into debt spirals could rapidly transform a stable peasant household into a vulnerable one, or even result in enslavement or displacement. Social failures could be equally devastating. Violations of community norms, religious taboos, or reciprocal obligations might lead to ostracism or loss of critical support networks. Unlike modern society, where bankruptcy offers legal protection and fresh starts, ancient economic failure often meant permanent status loss with impacts extending to your children and grandchildren. The narrow margin between survival and disaster meant small initial failures could cascade into catastrophic outcomes with remarkable speed. Your epic failure wouldn't become legendary beyond your local area, but might be preserved in community memory as a cautionary tale for generations. Remember what happened to Aristos when he planted before the Pleiades rose, becoming shorthand for ignoring traditional wisdom with disastrous results. Historical examples of peasant success stories remain primarily local legends rather than documented cases. The farmer who accurately predicted weather patterns, saving multiple harvests. the craftswoman whose distinctive pottery gained regional recognition, the village elder whose diplomatic skills prevented community destruction during conflicts, the religious specialist whose rituals seemingly brought rain during drought. These achievements lived in oral tradition rather than written records that prioritized elite accomplishments. The ancient Greek equivalent of local heroes existed in every community, providing models of excellence within peasant parameters rather than transformative class transcendence. These weren't the Homeric heroes of epic poetry, but practical success stories celebrating virtues accessible to ordinary people: reliability, wisdom, skill, foresight, and community contribution. Your own success, should you achieve it, would likely be remembered similarly. Not in written histories, but in stories told around evening fires, gradually embellished, but preserving the core values your community most respected. The psychological experience of advancement or failure in peasant society differed fundamentally from modern individualistic achievement orientation. Success wasn't personal triumph, but family and community enhancement. Failure wasn't individual shortcoming, but collective vulnerability. The emotional satisfaction came not from standing above others, but from increased security and community recognition. The modern concept of competitive achievement would have seemed both strange and dangerous in a context where survival depended on cooperation and resource sharing. Your greatest moment of glory might never be documented, celebrated beyond your immediate community, or even recognized by distant authorities, yet could provide profound satisfaction through the concrete improvements in life conditions it created for those you cared about most. This different relationship with achievement, oriented toward collective welfare rather than individual distinction, created a form of success that modern success literature rarely acknowledges: the profound satisfaction of contributing to community resilience in ways that outlast individual lives through the transmission of wisdom, practices, and values that sustain human welfare across generations. So you've beaten the odds and somehow reached what passes for old age in ancient Greece. First, a hearty congratulations is in order. You've successfully navigated childhood diseases, agricultural accidents, warfare, famine, and countless other deadly threats that claimed most of your contemporaries long before they developed those distinguished gray hairs. You've reached your 50s or 60s, which in peasant society qualifies you as genuinely elderly. The bad news? There's no retirement plan waiting. No pension, no social security, no senior discounts at the local market. If you think this is bad, just wait until you see what passes for elder care in ancient Greece. The concept of retirement simply didn't exist for peasants. You worked until you physically couldn't, then transitioned to progressively lighter tasks as your body failed. Those powerful arms that once wielded plows might be reduced to sorting seeds or weaving baskets. Your decades of agricultural knowledge remained valuable even as your physical contribution diminished. In the best-case scenario, you'd have adult children who gradually assumed the heaviest labor while you shifted to advisory and supervisory roles. This wasn't leisure-filled golden years, but a slow reduction in physical demands matched to your decreasing capabilities. The modern retirement dream of traveling the world or pursuing hobbies would have seemed absurdly indulgent, not to mention practically impossible. Your retirement plan consisted entirely of having children who survived to adulthood and remained willing and able to support you when you could no longer fully support yourself. This arrangement wasn't sentimental family loyalty, but practical intergenerational dependency. They needed your knowledge and property rights. You needed their physical labor and care. Physical deterioration in a society without modern medicine was particularly brutal. Arthritis from decades of physical labor made movement increasingly painful. Dental issues accumulated throughout life. Abscesses, lost teeth, and chronic infections made eating difficult and nutrition poor. Vision deteriorated without corrective options beyond, perhaps crude, magnifying glasses for the wealthy, certainly not available to peasants. Hearing loss went completely unaddressed. Digestive problems, cardiovascular issues, and respiratory conditions all progressed without effective treatments. This is actually the best part of ancient aging. You didn't have to worry about dying from cancer, heart disease, or diabetes, because you'd likely succumb to infection, injury, or acute illness long before chronic conditions reached advanced stages. The modern elderly worry about quality of life during extended longevity. Your concern was simply surviving each season as your physical resilience diminished. Pain management consisted primarily of alcohol, herbal preparations of varying effectiveness, and simply enduring what couldn't be changed. Your social status as an elder was perhaps the one bright spot in this otherwise grim picture. Unlike modern society, where youth is glorified and aging often brings invisibility, ancient Greek communities generally accorded significant respect to the elderly. This wasn't abstract reverence, but practical recognition of accumulated knowledge vital to community survival. You'd likely hold important roles in decision-making, dispute resolution, and knowledge transmission. Religious rituals and community celebrations would reserve honored positions for elders. Your opinions carried weight simply because you had survived long enough to acquire wisdom others needed. This elevated status provided some compensation for physical decline, offering social influence even as personal capability decreased. Of course, this respect remained contingent on your mental acuity. If you developed what we now recognize as dementia or other cognitive impairments, that respected position could quickly transform into burdensome dependency with few support options beyond family care. Housing arrangements in old age depended entirely on family structure. Ideally, you'd continue living in your established home with adult children and their families in a multi-generational household. Property typically remained under the elder's formal control until death, even as practical management transitioned to younger generations. This arrangement provided both physical care and maintained your authority within the family structure. For those without children, options narrowed dramatically, perhaps living with extended family if they were willing, or facing a vulnerable existence trying to maintain independence with failing physical abilities. There were no retirement communities, nursing facilities, or dedicated elder housing. Your living situation in old age was determined entirely by the family relationships you'd cultivated throughout life and their economic circumstances when you reached dependency. The ancient Greek version of long-term care insurance was having multiple children, treating them well enough that they felt obligated to care for you, and hoping at least some survived to adulthood. Widowhood created particular vulnerabilities, especially for women. Greek society structured property, rights, and economic participation primarily through male household heads. A widow's position depended largely on adult sons who could assume the male household role, or failing that, male relatives who might incorporate her into their households, often as a servant rather than honored elder. Widowers faced fewer social and economic constraints, but increased practical challenges in maintaining households without female labor for essential domestic activities. Second marriages were common practical solutions for both genders, often based more on household economic needs than romantic attachment. These arrangements weren't just personal preferences, but survival strategies in a world where individual independence was rarely viable, particularly in advanced age. The modern concept of the independent elderly person living alone would have seemed both strange and deeply unfortunate. Isolation wasn't privacy, but abandonment in a society where interdependence was the only functional survival strategy. Healthcare in old age was essentially identical to healthcare in youth. Limited, often ineffective, and primarily palliative rather than curative. What changed was the expectation of outcome. While vigorous youth might recover from illness through natural resilience despite ineffective treatments, the elderly were understood to have diminished recuperative capacity. Serious illness in old age was generally expected to be fatal, with care focused on comfort rather than cure. Some herbal traditions specifically addressed conditions common in aging: pain management, digestive issues, sleep difficulties, with varying effectiveness. Religious healing remained important, with specific deities associated with old age and its challenges. The elderly often became particularly devoted to religious practices as their physical world contracted and mortality loomed closer. Unlike modern end-of-life care, with its emphasis on extending life regardless of quality, ancient approaches accepted death as the natural conclusion to aging, focusing on proper transition rather than desperate prolongation. The psychological challenges of aging included watching your world progressively contract. Friends and family members died. Mobility limitations reduced your physical range, and sensory impairments diminished your connection to surroundings. Without books, television, or other passive entertainment options, reduced physical capability meant increasingly limited engagement with the world. Your sphere of interaction gradually narrowed to immediate household and occasional community gatherings. Mental stimulation came primarily through social interaction, oral tradition, and the problem-solving of daily life rather than media consumption or deliberate cognitive exercise. Depression in the elderly certainly existed, but wasn't conceptualized as a medical condition requiring intervention. It was seen as a natural response to loss and limitation, addressed through religious frameworks, community inclusion, and family support rather than therapeutic approaches. The concept of successful aging meant maintaining function and contribution as long as possible, then accepting limitation with dignity rather than fighting for independence at all costs. End-of-life expectations differed fundamentally from modern assumptions. A good death meant dying at home, surrounded by family, having put one's affairs in order, fulfilled religious obligations, and transmitted essential knowledge to the next generation. This wasn't just emotional preference, but practical necessity. Hospital care didn't exist, and family members provided the only available death attendance. Funeral practices emphasized proper transition to the afterlife through specific rituals rather than memorialization of individual personality. Burial customs varied by region and historical period, but typically involved washing and dressing the body, a funeral procession, lamentation rituals, and interment with objects thought useful in the afterlife. Mourning practices were formalized and extended, with prescribed behaviors and time periods for different categories of survivors. These weren't just emotional expressions, but social signals and religious obligations believed to protect both the deceased and the community. Your preparation for death wouldn't involve estate planning with attorneys, but ensuring your children knew where everything was stored, which gods required which offerings, when to plant each crop, and other practical knowledge essential for their continued survival. The economic implications of an aging population were minimal compared to modern concerns. Low life expectancy meant the elderly remained a small percentage of the total population rather than the demographic bulge modern societies face. No public pension systems meant no government burden for elder support. The productivity gap between youth and age in agricultural societies was less pronounced than in knowledge economies. While physical strength diminished, knowledge and judgment continued to contribute significant value to family enterprises. The ancient dependency ratio operated at family rather than societal level, with each household managing its own balance of productive and dependent members across the life cycle. This system provided functional elder support as long as family structures remained intact, but offered minimal safety net for those without family connections. The most vulnerable elderly weren't those with the most serious health conditions, but those with the weakest social networks, a pattern that arguably persists despite modern institutional supports. Intergenerational knowledge transfer represented your most significant contribution in old age. Your decades of experience with local growing conditions, weather patterns, craft techniques, and community relationships couldn't be replaced by general principles or written instructions. This knowledge had life or death implications for the next generation's agricultural success and couldn't be risked through loss at death. As physical capacity declined, your role increasingly centered on this teaching function, ensuring younger family members absorbed the accumulated wisdom that had kept you alive long enough to become elderly. This wasn't formal education, but practical apprenticeship in survival techniques, often transmitted through shared work, stories, proverbs, and demonstration. The modern elderly worry about becoming burdensome. Your concern would be ensuring your essential knowledge transferred before you died. Your legacy wasn't financial inheritance or personal achievements, but the continued survival and prosperity of your descendants, equipped with the wisdom you'd accumulated through decades of direct experience with a specific place and its challenges. Mortality was certain. What remained negotiable was whether your death also meant the loss of crucial knowledge that had taken a lifetime to accumulate. So we've reached the end of our journey through the glamorous life of an ancient Greek peasant. You've survived childhood, unlikely, mastered backbreaking agricultural techniques, painful, navigated complex social hierarchies, stressful, appeased countless deities, expensive, avoided numerous everyday dangers, barely, achieved modest success at best, underwhelming, and reached old age, surprising. Now let's consider how this lifestyle appears from our modern perspective and the peculiar ways we've romanticized what was essentially a brutal existence of constant labor and precarity. If you think this is bad, just wait until you see how modern hipsters have reimagined ancient agricultural life as some sort of idyllic communion with nature rather than the desperate struggle for survival it actually was. The modern idealization of ancient Greek civilization typically focuses on Athens during its brief democratic flowering. Philosophy, drama, art, and political innovation dominate our historical imagination. This selective memory conveniently ignores that these cultural achievements rested on the agricultural surplus produced by a peasant majority who participated minimally in these celebrated aspects of Greek culture. The Parthenon wasn't built by philosophers, but funded by taxes ultimately sourced from agricultural production. Socratic dialogues weren't concerned with optimal planning techniques or pest management strategies that occupied most Greeks' daily thoughts. Our historical spotlight illuminates the exceptional while leaving the typical in darkness. This isn't just academic oversight, but active distortion. We remember what elites wrote about themselves rather than the unrecorded experiences of the majority. This pattern persists in how we conceptualize our own society, focusing on exceptional stories of mobility and achievement rather than typical experiences of limitation and constraint. Contemporary Back to the Land movements often romanticize traditional agricultural practices, imagining ancient farming as somehow more authentic, harmonious, or environmentally sound than modern methods. This rosy revisionism conveniently ignores that ancient agriculture was often environmentally destructive. Deforestation was widespread, erosion uncontrolled, and sustainable practices existed alongside devastating ones. Ancient farmers weren't early environmentalists, but pragmatic survivors using available knowledge to extract maximum yield from limited resources. They practiced organic farming not from philosophical commitment, but because chemical alternatives didn't exist. They ate locally sourced, seasonal food not from ethical choice, but because transportation and preservation limitations eliminated other options. They used every part of slaughtered animals and minimized waste not from ecological consciousness, but from economic necessity. This is actually the best part of modern misconceptions. Imagining that ancient peasants were making enlightened choices rather than doing whatever it took to survive another season regardless of long-term consequences. The physical reality of ancient agricultural labor receives particular whitewashing in modern imagination. Contemporary hobby gardeners might spend pleasant weekend hours tending vegetables with ergonomic tools before returning to climate-controlled homes. This bears no resemblance to dawn-to-dusk physical labor using wooden implements, performed regardless of weather conditions, with survival directly contingent on outcome. The physical toll, chronic pain, repetitive stress injuries, premature aging, rarely enters our romanticized version of simple living. Modern farm-to-table enthusiasts celebrate connections to food sources that ancient peasants would have gladly exchanged for the convenience of grocery stores and reliable supply chains. The back-breaking reality of grain harvesting, threshing, and processing gets condensed in a charming imagery of amber waves rather than the exhausting, time-sensitive ordeal it actually represented. Our fitness culture might fetishize functional movements and natural exercise, but few CrossFit enthusiasts would voluntarily adopt the dawn-to-dusk labor schedule of ancient farmers, despite its undeniable effectiveness for building functional strength. Religious and spiritual dimensions of ancient life undergo similar romantic distortion. Contemporary neo-paganism often envisions ancient Greek religion as an earth-centered, goddess-worshipping tradition celebrating natural cycles, a projection of modern environmental concerns onto ancient practices that were fundamentally transactional rather than reverential. Ancient agricultural rituals weren't celebrating Mother Earth, but attempting to control unpredictable forces through divine intervention. The psychologically complex relationship with deities encompassed fear, obligation, and negotiation more than loving communion. Modern spiritual seekers drawn to ancient practices typically cherry-pick aesthetically pleasing elements while ignoring the animal sacrifice, rigid hierarchies, and pragmatic materialism that characterized actual practice. This selective adoption reflects our desire for spiritual frameworks that validate contemporary values rather than engaging with genuinely different worldviews on their own terms. Ancient Greeks would likely find modern spiritual appropriation of their religious practices both confusing and amusing, particularly the absence of actual sacrifices, which they considered the essential core of effective religious practice. The social dimensions of ancient peasant life receive perhaps the most dramatic reimagining. Modern individualism struggles to comprehend the deeply embedded, non-optional nature of ancient community structures. Contemporary intentional communities represent chosen affiliations that can be abandoned if unsatisfying. Ancient villages were inescapable contexts where social standing directly impacted survival chances. The modern concept of finding yourself through personal exploration would have seemed not just self-indulgent, but actively dangerous in a world where identity derived from community position and role fulfillment. Gender roles that modern observers find restrictive were experienced as natural and necessary divisions, optimizing survival chances rather than arbitrary limitations. The intensive social surveillance of small communities, where everyone knew everyone's business, wasn't an invasion of privacy, but an essential information system ensuring norm compliance and resource distribution. Our contemporary celebration of privacy, personal choice, and self-determination would have appeared not as freedoms, but as terrifying isolation to people whose survival depended on stable social integration. Technological contrasts between ancient and modern life extend far beyond obvious comparisons of tools and machines. The fundamental difference lies in relationship to information. Ancient knowledge transmission depended entirely on direct human interaction, making each elder's death a potential loss of survival-critical information. Modern information technology has externalized memory and knowledge transmission, creating unprecedented access while potentially diminishing the social bonds traditionally formed through direct teaching relationships. Ancient technical innovation moved at intergenerational pace, with major changes occurring across centuries rather than years. This wasn't intellectual stagnation, but practical risk management. When failure meant starvation, radical experimentation carried unacceptable costs. Modern celebration of disruption and rapid innovation reflects our insulation from direct survival consequences of failure. The ancient approach prioritized reliability over efficiency, tradition over innovation, and certainty over possibility. Values that made perfect sense in their context, but conflict with contemporary emphasis on progress and improvement. Economic comparisons reveal equally profound differences in fundamental assumptions. The ancient peasant economy focused on sufficiency rather than growth, stability rather than advancement, and risk mitigation rather than opportunity maximization. Wealth was primarily conceived as concrete resources, land, livestock, tools, food stores, rather than abstract financial instruments. Economic relationships were embedded in social contexts rather than operating as independent transactions, with obligations determined by community, standing, and kinship as much as market principles. The modern separation between economic and social spheres would have seemed artificial and potentially dangerous, removing crucial context for judging reliability and trustworthiness. Ancient economic success meant maintaining stable sufficiency across seasonal cycles and unpredictable events, not accumulating beyond need or expanding production for its own sake. This difference reflects not limited ambition, but practical recognition of the diminishing returns and increased vulnerability that could accompany excess in a world without reliable storage, transportation, or security systems to protect surplus. Health and bodily experience perhaps represent the most unbridgeable gap between ancient and modern life. Contemporary people might romanticize natural living while relying on antibiotics, vaccines, pain management, corrective surgery, and preventative screening that have fundamentally transformed the experience of embodiment. Ancient acceptance of pain, disability, and early death wasn't philosophical detachment, but practical adaptation to unalterable conditions. The intimate familiarity with death, encountering it regularly from childhood through direct experience rather than mediated through screens or segregated in hospitals, created a fundamentally different relationship with mortality than modern death-denying cultures sustain. Physical suffering wasn't extraordinary, but expected, managed through cultural frameworks emphasizing endurance rather than elimination. Modern medical expectations of cure, comfort, and extended functionality would have seemed utterly fantastical to people who experienced illness primarily as something to be endured rather than solved, with outcome determined by fate or divine will rather than intervention quality. The ultimate irony of our retrospective view lies in how many aspects of ancient peasant life we're now attempting to reclaim after industrialization. Connection to natural cycles, locally sourced food, intergenerational living, community interdependence, craft production, and direct relationship with food sources. Having engineered these elements out of modern existence through centuries of technological and social development, we now selectively reintroduce them as lifestyle choices rather than survival necessities. This a la carte approach to tradition, adopting aesthetically pleasing or psychologically satisfying elements while maintaining modern conveniences and choices, reveals our fundamentally different relationship with necessity. We play at being ancient farmers on weekend garden plots while relying on grocery stores when crops fail. We experiment with intergenerational housing while maintaining the option of institutional care. We join intentional communities while keeping exit options open. This isn't hypocrisy, but the luxury of choice that ancient peoples simply didn't possess. The freedom to selectively incorporate traditional practices into otherwise modern lives represents perhaps the greatest privilege our technological society has created. The ability to choose our relationship with necessity rather than having it imposed by circumstance. What, then, would ancient Greek peasants think of us if they could somehow observe our modern lives? They would likely be simultaneously amazed by our material abundance and confused by our apparent unhappiness within it. The concept of having sufficient food, yet deliberately restricting intake for appearance reasons, would seem insane. Our climate-controlled environments, instant communication, and medical interventions would appear magical. Yet our social isolation, environmental detachment, and existential anxiety might provoke pity rather than envy. They might wonder how people with so many survival problems solved could still struggle to find meaning, purpose, and connection. The ancient peasant viewing modern life might conclude that solving material problems simply reveals the non-material challenges that have always defined human experience. Finding meaning within mortality, connection within individuality, and purpose within cosmic insignificance. Perhaps the most valuable perspective ancient lives offer isn't practical knowledge about agricultural techniques or social organization, but the reminder that human fulfillment has never been primarily determined by material circumstances. People found meaning, joy, connection, and purpose within even the most challenging conditions, suggesting these achievements depend less on external circumstances than on internal and social resources that remain accessible regardless of technological environment. So why wouldn't you last a day as a Greek peasant? Beyond the obvious physical challenges and absent skills, the fundamental barrier would be psychological. the inability to accept limitation, uncertainty, and embeddedness as normal rather than impositions to be overcome. Your modern expectations of control, choice, comfort, and individual determination would collide catastrophically with a world where acceptance, endurance, tradition, and community determination were the only viable strategies for survival. Yet examining this unbridgeable gap between ancient and modern experience offers something valuable. Perspective on which aspects of our current condition represent genuine human constants and which reflect particular historical circumstances we've mistaken for universal truths. The ancient Greek peasant life, stripped of romantic distortion and viewed in its harsh reality, provides not a model to emulate, but a contrast that clarifies our own assumptions. Their world offers neither superior wisdom nor primitive limitation, but simply a different configuration of the fundamental human challenge, creating meaning, connection, and sufficiency within whatever constraints reality provides. Their success in doing so under conditions we would find intolerable suggests greater human adaptability than our comfort-oriented culture typically acknowledges, and raises profound questions about whether our material progress has been matched by corresponding advances in addressing the non-material aspects of human flourishing.